What would you do if, in the middle of a raging blizzard, a half-frozen German shepherd appeared at your doorstep, and she wasn't alone? Would you turn her away, knowing she might not survive the night? Or would you open your door to a mother desperate to save her newborn pups? Jack, a retired firefighter longing for peace and solitude, faced this exact choice one brutal winter night. But when he welcomed the trembling dog and her tiny pups inside, he had no idea the danger wasn't over. Who was she running from? What secrets hid behind her haunted eyes? And when a shadow from her past returned, would Jack be ready to protect them all? The truth will leave you stunned. Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The Snowstorm Show. No mercy as it howled around Jack's isolated cabin. Fierce gusts of wind hurled ice crystals against the sturdy wooden walls, and outside, the world was a swirling chaos of white. Jack, a retired firefighter, had spent days alone, his only companion the crackling fireplace that cast dancing shadows across the living room. The storm brought a deep silence, broken only by the occasional crack of burning logs. Late that evening, when the wind seemed at its worst, Jack heard a faint sound outside. At first, he thought it was the wind's trick. But then it came again, soft scratching against the front door, followed by a weak whimper. Setting his coffee mug aside, he got up, heart thudding in his chest. Through the frosted glass of the door, he discerned a shape pressed against the swirling snow. He opened the door a few inches, and a frigid blast of air nearly stole his breath. There, huddled and shivering, stood a German shepherd. Ice clung to her fur, and her breaths escaped in desperate puffs. Even more startling, she wasn't alone. Two tiny puppies, barely old enough to open their eyes, clung to her side. The mother's body was visibly trembling, and her haunted eyes flicked up at Jack in a plea that struck him to his core. In a single moment, Jack understood that letting them in would mean taking on a huge responsibility. He had retired from a life of constant danger, longing for calm days and solitude. But the dog's eyes held him captive. Without another thought, he pulled the door wide, beckoning them in. "Come on," he murmured, crouching low. "You'll freeze out there." The German shepherd hesitated, glancing warily between Jack and the storm. Carefully, she nudged the first pup forward, then picked it up by the scruff when it stumbled in the snow. The second pup followed, sliding over the icy doorstep and into the cabin. As soon as all three were safely inside, Jack slammed the door shut, shutting out the furious wind. In the sudden warmth, the mother dog's legs nearly gave way. Jack quickly grabbed a threadbare blanket from his couch and spread it out near the fireplace. The dog flinched at his movement, issuing a low, uncertain growl that was more of a warning than true aggression. Jack eased his hands up. "Easy," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." He stepped back, giving her room. She sniffed the air, eyeing him with caution, before finally settling down onto the blanket. The puppies wriggled at her side, voicing tiny squeaks as they sought her warmth. It was clear they were exhausted, half-frozen, and probably hadn't eaten well in days. Jack's heart clenched at the sight. He fetched a bowl of warm water from his small kitchen and set it down, keeping his distance. The mother dog, though frail, jerked her head up to drink. Her pups made soft sounds, noses quivering as they inched closer to her belly. For a moment, Jack simply watched them, the gravity of what he'd done settling upon him. He had no dog food in the cabin, no prior plans to care for animals. But something about this scene, a desperate mother fighting for her babies, stirred feelings of compassion he couldn't turn away from. Late into the night, Jack stoked the fire and checked on his unexpected guests. The German shepherd never fully relaxed, but her growls subsided as she realized he posed no threat. From a respectful distance, Jack observed her condition, ribs showing, fur dirty and matted with ice, and her eyes clouded by fatigue. Yet she was alive. More than that, she was still protecting her young. It was that steadfast that made Jack feel an unexpected surge of admiration. Before turning in, he set out a few towels near the fireplace to keep the little family warmer. The pups, now safer and in the glow of the hearth, burrowed into the folds of fabric. Their mother, as if sensing relief for the first time, let out a trembling sigh, resting her chin on her paws. Jack sank into his armchair, a wave of responsibility settling over him. He'd wanted a quiet retirement, but fate, or maybe the blizzard, had other plans. He watched the embers glow in the fireplace and listened to the wind slowly die down outside. Within this remote cabin, 3 new lives had been placed in his hands, relying on him for survival. And though he didn't know what came next, Jack felt a quiet resolve building in his chest. He had saved people from burning buildings and raging infernos in the past. Taking in a dog and her pups might just be another kind of rescue, one that might save them all in unexpected ways. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the snowy landscape, Jack awoke in his armchair. A calm silence replaced the raging storm of the night before, and the cabin's windows revealed a world blanketed in fresh snowdrifts. He eased himself up, muscles aching from sleeping upright, and glanced toward the fireplace. The German Shepherd was still there, curled protectively around the 2 pups. The mother dog stirred at his movement. Raising her head, her eyes met his, cautious, perhaps still afraid, but no longer desperate. The pups twitched against her, tiny limbs pushing through the remnants of the blanket. "Morning," Jack murmured, though he had no idea if the dog understood him. He moved to the kitchen, found a can of chicken soup, and heated it gently on the stove. It wasn't an ideal meal for a dog, but it would warm her from the inside out. After pouring some into a bowl, he set it down a few feet from the mother, stepping back so as not to crowd her. She sniffed the air, then slowly rose, muscles protesting from cold and weakness. The pups squeaked in protest at being jostled, but she gave them a quick nuzzle and limped toward the makeshift meal. Leaning down, she lapped at the soup, her eyes darting nervously between Jack and the door. Yet hunger overpowered her fear, and she drank until the bowl was empty. Jack watched with a twist in his chest. She was fragile and underfed, her coat dull and ragged around her flanks. The pups were so small, their eyes barely open. He wondered if they were newborns. How had they survived such brutal weather? He couldn't begin to imagine. Determined to help, he reached for his phone. The nearest veterinary clinic was miles away, but he needed professional advice. After a short wait on hold, a cheerful receptionist answered. Jack introduced himself, explaining in brief how the dog had shown up in the storm with 2 puppies. "They're in rough shape," he added. "Think you can fit us in today?" The receptionist assured him they'd make room. Jack hung up, relief washing over him. As he returned to the living room, he saw the mother dog watching him intently. Her posture was tense, but her eyes no longer held that raw desperation. "Vet visit this afternoon," he told her, as if she could comprehend every word. "We'll see what we can do to help you and your little ones." Getting them to the clinic wasn't easy. Although the snowplows had cleared the main roads, Jack's driveway remained a churn of drifts. He spent over an hour clearing enough space for his old pickup to get through. Then came the delicate task of guiding the mother dog and her pups outside. She growled softly when he lifted her first pup, a warning that reminded him she still didn't fully trust him. But with calm reassurance and gentle handling, he settled the pups in a padded box on the passenger seat. Then he coaxed the mother into the back, spreading blankets to keep her warm. She stepped inside cautiously, gazing at him with equal parts gratitude and unease. The road to town was slick, requiring slow driving. Jack glanced over from time to time, checking that his passengers were okay. The mother dog stood sentinel, eyes on her puppies, as if every nerve in her body was dedicated to keeping them safe. Despite her exhaustion, she refused to lie down, and Jack felt another pang of admiration. This was a fighter, plain and simple. At the vet clinic, Dr. Monroe and her staff examined the new arrivals with professional efficiency. "She's badly underweight," Dr. Monroe said, running her hands over the shepherd's protruding ribs. "But she's hanging in there. We'll do a quick check on the puppies, too." One pup gave a tiny yawn. The other squirmed at being touched, letting out a faint squeak. The staff's coos of sympathy and encouragement filled the small exam room. After taking temperatures, checking heart rates, and making sure there were no immediate critical issues, Dr. Monroe recommended a course of medication for parasites and told Jack to keep them warm and fed. "She'll need proper nutrition, Dr. Monroe said, giving the shepherd a soft pat. "High-protein food, plenty of clean water, and bring them back in a week for a follow-up. Looks like she's been through a storm both literally and figuratively." Jack nodded, a lump in his throat. "Got it. Thank you." As he looked down at the exhausted mother, he felt a rush of protectiveness he hadn't expected. She had come this far against all odds. Her eyes flicked to him, and something unspoken seemed to pass between them, a tiny seed of trust. On the drive back, Jack found himself talking to her. "I think I'll call you Grace," he mused, testing the name out loud. "You've definitely got a lot of grace in you, surviving what you did." Though the dog couldn't respond in words, her ears twitched at the sound. It felt right. Grace and her puppies had a certain dignity to them, even in their fragile state. For the rest of the journey, Jack thought about the changes taking root in his quiet life. He'd saved lives before, but never quite like this. A battered German shepherd and her pups had found shelter at his door, and that single act of compassion was about to reshape his retirement in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Back at the cabin, Jack set the box of puppies on the living room floor by the fire, where he'd laid out fresh towels. The warmth and flicker of flames calmed the two little ones, who wriggled around, letting out soft squeaks as Grace hovered nearby. Her eyes flickered with concern each time one of her pups wriggled too far from her side. Jack offered Grace a bowl of special high-protein dog food he'd purchased at the clinic. She sniffed it warily, then began to eat, her exhaustion momentarily overshadowed by hunger. Sitting down on the floor a comfortable distance away, Jack watched them quietly, letting Grace sense his presence without feeling threatened. Days bled into one another as the world outside remained cold and unforgiving. Jack fell into a new routine, waking early to stoke the fire, preparing food for Grace, and ensuring the pups were warm and fed. He spent long hours reading by the fireplace, occasionally breaking the silence to speak softly to Grace. Little by little, her guarded stance relaxed. One afternoon, while the pups, whom Jack named Snow and Ash, slept in a bundle of blankets, Grace ventured closer to Jack's chair. He slowly extended his hand, palm open. Her posture went stiff, but she didn't back away. Inch by inch, Grace leaned in to sniff his fingers. Her ears pinned back in uncertainty, and her eyes held caution, but she didn't growl. "That's it," Jack whispered, heart pounding as if this were a high-stakes negotiation. "No one's going to hurt you here." Grace exhaled, a soft huff escaping her muzzle. Then, with a resolve that seemed to surprise even herself, she brushed her nose against Jack's hand. It lasted only a second before she withdrew, but it was enough. In that moment, trust began to blossom. By the end of the first week, Grace was walking around the cabin with more confidence. Her ribs were still visible, but she was putting on weight. Snow and Ash found their voices, emitting playful yips as they explored the edges of the living room. If one tumbled too far, Grace would gently herd it back to the safety of the blanket. Although he never said it aloud, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose growing inside him. Retirement had given him time to dwell on old memories, some of them painful from his days as a firefighter. He'd witnessed more than a share of suffering. Yet seeing Grace and her pups slowly heal brought a light into his life he didn't realize he'd been missing. Still, questions nagged at him. Where had Grace come from? Why was she in such dire shape? The scars on her coat and her skittish behavior hinted at a grim backstory. Late at night, as the wind moaned outside, Jack sometimes saw a flash of fear in Grace's eyes that made him suspect she wasn't just a random stray. Tensions rose one evening when Jack stepped out to chop firewood. Snow had started to melt in patches, revealing frozen mud beneath. As he swung his axe into a log, he sensed a shift, like the air itself had changed. He paused, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but he felt watched. He carried the log back inside and bolted the door. Grace greeted him with a gentle wag of her tail, a sign of growing trust, and her pups bounded over in clumsy excitement. Despite the warmth within, Jack couldn't shake the prickling feeling that something was off beyond the protective circle of the cabin. When he peered out the window after dinner, he thought he glimpsed a fleeting shadow at the edge of the woods. It could have been a trick of the light or an animal prowling in the darkness. But the uneasy sensation remained. He whispered to Grace as she lay near the fire, "If there's someone out there, we'll deal with it. You're safe now, girl." She rested her chin on her paws, eyes half closed. But her ears twitched as if she understood every word. The next day, Jack drove to the local animal shelter, hoping someone might recognize Grace. Sarah, the volunteer on duty, shook her head after Jack showed her a photo. "She's not familiar. Might have been dumped by a breeder or an owner who couldn't handle puppies." The words hit Jack like a blow. He clenched his jaw, anger simmering at the thought that someone could abandon such a devoted mother. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Jack made sure every window was locked and the curtains drawn. He'd found footprints outside, footprints not his own, pressed into the slushy snow by the cabin's side. Tension prickled in the air. Grace paced restlessly, occasionally growling at the door. Jack didn't know who or what was lurking around, but he resolved to stay vigilant. The fire snapped, sending sparks up the chimney as Jack laid out fresh blankets for Snow and Ash. He watched Grace circle the pups before settling. Though she tried to appear calm, her glance at the window betrayed unease. Someone was out there. She sensed it as much as he did. Yet within the cabin, an unspoken bond had formed. Grace leaned her muzzle into Jack's hand whenever he offered comfort. Snow and Ash no longer feared him at all, pouncing on his feet or his pant legs with tiny barks. He might have spent years alone in the quiet of retirement, but he realized now just how lonely that solitude had been. As the night deepened, Jack lay awake in his armchair, rifle leaning against the wall close by. He listened to Grace's breathing and the pups' soft rustling in their sleep. If shadows lurked outside, they would not penetrate this circle of warmth and safety. He wasn't a stranger to danger. He'd survived blazing infernos and saved lives during his career. Now, he was determined to protect Grace and her pups with that same unwavering spirit. On a crisp morning, the last remnants of the snowstorm sparkled in the early sunlight, creating a dazzling view outside the cabin windows. Jack, however, felt no peace in that brightness. A night of restless vigilance had left him tired and wary. Grace had awakened several times, a low growl emanating from her throat as she stood guard near the pups. Determined not to let fear consume him, Jack stepped out with Grace and the pups for a brief taste of fresh air. Snow and Ash bounded clumsily around the porch, sniffing at pockets of snow still clinging to the edges. Grace ventured a few steps off the porch, her nose to the ground. Suddenly, she froze, muscles rippling beneath her coat, ears locked forward. Jack followed her gaze to the edge of the woods, though he spotted nothing. The tension in Grace's stance told him she sensed something, or someone, lurking. He scooped up the pups. "Let's head back inside," he muttered, heart thumping against his ribcage. Grace trotted close, casting wary glances over her shoulder. After shutting the door, Jack locked it and pulled the curtains tight. Everything about Grace's body language screamed that this was no random animal in the woods. Her haunted eyes betrayed recognition and dread. Jack decided enough was enough. He called the local sheriff's office. Deputy Miller, a tall, sharp-eyed woman who commanded quiet authority, arrived that afternoon. Grace tensed when the deputy knocked. Jack let her in, explaining that he'd seen footprints and sensed someone hovering around. Grace stayed close to her pups, letting out a low rumble of warning. Deputy Miller nodded, scanning the yard. "I'll take a look," she said. She returned a half-hour later, solemn. "I found fresh tracks near the tree line. Looks like somebody's camping out, or at least loitering nearby. Rope was tied to a branch. I can't tell if it's new or old, but it's definitely suspicious. We'll increase patrols. Keep your doors locked, Jack." With that, the deputy departed, leaving behind a swirl of unease. Jack ran a trembling hand through his hair. He looked over at Grace, who watched him with concern in her amber eyes. "We won't let anything happen to you," he whispered. Her ears flattened slightly, her gaze shifting to Snow and Ash, as if to say she worried not for herself, but for her babies. For a time, the days passed quietly, though the tension never fully subsided. Jack stayed vigilant. Grace seemed to sense his anxiety, occasionally pressing her nose to his arm in a silent gesture of solidarity. Snow and Ash were blissfully oblivious, romping through the cabin with clumsy enthusiasm. One late afternoon, as Jack was gathering kindling behind the cabin, he felt that oppressive sensation again, eyes on him from somewhere unseen. He spun, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but an eerie stillness hung between the trees. Heart pounding, he hurried back inside. Grace met him at the door, hackles raised. Night fell slowly, each minute dragging Jack's nerves tighter. He pulled up a chair by the front window, rifle propped against the wall. The cabin lights were off, leaving the room lit only by the flicker of the fireplace. Perhaps it was the dimness that made the outline visible, a tall figure standing near the edge of the woods, just beyond the porch light's reach. Jack's stomach twisted. He stood and crossed to the window, heart in his throat. Grace noticed his sudden movement and patted over, her own gaze zeroing in on that dark silhouette. A snarl rumbled from her chest, and she pressed forward as if wanted to bolt outside. "No," Jack commanded quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her neck. He dialed the sheriff's office again, voice hushed. "He's back," Jack said, breath catching. Same spot as before. By the time Deputy Miller arrived, the figure had vanished. She searched the perimeter with a flashlight, only to return shaking her head. "Tracks again, but they trail off into the woods. Whoever it is knows the land. I'll keep a close watch." After she left, Jack and Grace remained wide awake. Snow and Ash finally collapsed into puppy sleep, heedless of the tension. When dawn broke, Jack felt a heavy weight on his chest, as if a battle were brewing. He had no idea who this person was, but their persistence signaled a plan or an agenda involving Grace. All day, Jack wrestled with how to keep Grace and the pups safe. Could he move them elsewhere? The nearest town was still miles off. The veterinarian's clinic had no facilities for long-term care. Animal shelters were often overcrowded. Besides, deep in his heart, he couldn't bear the thought of handing Grace over to someone else. Not after what they had been through together. That afternoon, Grace surprised him by resting her head on his knee. He stroked her ears softly, feeling her lean into him. It was a gesture of trust, so complete it dissolved a portion of the fear he carried. "No one's going to tear this family apart," he whispered. "We'll face this together." Yet the uneasy truth remained. Whoever lurked in the woods was determined enough to return twice. If it was indeed Grace's former owner, it meant she had fled a bad situation. Abandonment? Abuse? Jack only had guesses, but he resolved that if this individual came looking to reclaim her, they'd have to go through him first. By the time night fell again, the cabin was secured. Jack placed a few lanterns outside, hoping light might deter any approach. Grace refused to settle, pacing and occasionally standing guard at the door. Snow and Ash, with innocent puppy eyes, curled up on her tail, drifting into dreams while their mother stood vigilant. Jack kept watch by the window, the rifle never far from reach. He told himself he was ready for whatever might happen next. Though his retirement had been intended as a quiet retreat, it now felt like the site of a final stand, one he would not lose. The dawn broke clear and cold. Jack nursed a cup of coffee by the window, eyes scanning the snowy expanse. The night had passed without incident, but tension still simmered beneath the veneer of calm. A sense of foreboding needled at him, warning him not to let his guard down. Grace seemed on edge too. She hovered protectively near Snow and Ash, scarcely letting them wander out of reach. The pups, fully trusting, pranced around obliviously, occasionally tumbling over each other and eliciting small yips of excitement. Jack could see in Grace's gaze that she sensed something in the frosty air. He was about to refill his coffee when Grace darted to the door, emitting a guttural growl. Jack glanced outside through a narrow gap in the curtains, and his blood ran cold. A man stood at the edge of the porch. He was in his 40s, wearing a tattered hooded jacket, and his eyes were fixed on the cabin. A length of rope dangled from his left hand. With a quick inhale, Jack grabbed his rifle and opened the door a crack, the frigid air biting his face. "Who are you?" Jack called, voice steady with forced courage. "This is private property." The man stepped forward, a menacing glint in his eyes. "That's my dog," he said, nodding toward Grace, who now stood beside Jack, lip curled and teeth bared. "I've been tracking her. She ran off with those pups. I'm here to take what's mine." A wave of anger and protectiveness surged through Jack. "She showed up at my door, starved and half frozen. If she's really yours, you did a hell of a job taking care of her." The man shrugged, an ugly smirk twisting his features. "Dogs get out, it happens. Hand her over, old man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jack steadied his rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at the intruder's chest. "You're not taking her anywhere. Now get off my property." For a moment, the man seemed poised to argue. Then he locked eyes with Grace, who advanced a step, letting loose a ferocious snarl. Fear flickered over his face. He must have recognized the fiery devotion in her eyes, a readiness to defend her pups at any cost. He backed up, dropping the rope onto the porch. "You'll regret this," he spat, voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You have no idea what she's capable of." Jack's heart hammered, but he forced himself to stand firm. "I know enough," he replied, not lowering the rifle. "Leave. Now." The man retreated into the woods, his threat echoing in the hush of the morning. When he was finally out of sight, Jack slowly shut the door, locking it. Grace remained at his side, body coiled and trembling, ears flattened in a cocktail of fear and rage. Hey, Jack whispered, setting his rifle down and gently placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "He's gone. It's over." Grace's intense growling softened, and she released a quivering breath. Snow and Ash peeked out from behind a chair, wide-eyed at the tension. Grace padded over to them, nuzzling each pup as if to reassure them of her presence. Jack felt the knots in his stomach slowly unwind, though the adrenaline still pulsed in his veins. He wasted no time calling Deputy Miller, reporting the encounter. Within an hour, she arrived, took down every detail, and promised to patrol the area more frequently. A judge might grant a protective order, but that's tricky when it comes to animals, she admitted regretfully. "Still, I'll do what I can." After she left, Jack stepped outside to gather the rope the man had discarded. It felt ominous in his hands, a symbol of captivity or worse. He burned it in the fireplace, watching it curl and turn to ash. In the days that followed, neither Jack nor Grace let their guard down. Yet something remarkable also unfolded. With the danger out in the open, Grace's fearful reserve seemed to lift. She no longer growled at every slight movement or noise. Perhaps confronting her tormentor had offered her a kind of release, a final line drawn in the sand. Snow and Ash grew bolder, yapping excitedly around the cabin. They treated Grace and Jack alike as their guardians, bounding over each morning to greet him with bright, curious eyes. With each passing day, Grace's ribs were less visible, her coat thicker, and her spirit more confident. Jack watched her with a sense of pride he'd never expected to feel again. One frosty evening, as the sun dipped behind snow-covered pines, Jack settled in his old armchair by the fire. Grace approached, resting her muzzle against his knee. The pups clambered around, eventually piling up near the warmth of the fireplace. Jack stroked Grace's ears, and for the first time, she fully leaned her weight against him. No tension, no hesitation. "You're safe now," Jack murmured, voice thick with gratitude and emotion. He remembered the night she appeared at his door, half dead in the storm. How far they had come together. In saving Grace, Snow, and Ash, he discovered a new sense of purpose in his own life. Whatever darkness lurked in the past, they had faced it. The man might try to return, but Jack wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Grace. They had each other, and That was a bond strong enough to weather any storm. Grace's journey from the icy darkness to the warmth of Jack's cabin epitomizes resilience, courage, and the power of second chances. From the moment she braved a harrowing blizzard with two tiny pups relying on her for survival, she displayed a determination that few could match. Jack, a retired firefighter who had sought a quiet existence far from life's turbulence, found himself called to action once more. By opening his door, he opened his heart, forging a unique bond with Grace and her puppies, Snow and Ash. Their story testifies to the impact love and empathy can have on even the direst situations. Grace, once trembling with desperation, blossomed under Jack's care, reclaiming her strength and spirit. In turn, Jack rediscovered his own sense of purpose, protecting this newfound family from a looming threat and providing them with a safe haven. Together, they confronted the man who had once abandoned or mistreated Grace, proving that compassion is mightier than cruelty. Such tales shine a light on the countless animals that endure hardship through no fault of their own. Grace's bravery urges us to think of the vulnerable creatures in need of rescue and reminds us how simple acts of kindness can mean the difference between life and death. Whether by adopting an animal from shelter, donating resources, or volunteering time, we can all become part of a larger effort to give dogs like Grace the second chance they so fiercely deserve. Let this story be an inspiration for caring individuals everywhere. May we learn to open our doors and our hearts when others need it most.